There is a particular cruelty in the universe's timing. For 30 years, Jordan Peterson stood before lecture halls, cameras, and millions of searching minds and delivered a message that cut through the noise of a distracted age. Life is suffering, and the only response worthy of a human being is to carry that suffering with meaning. He built an intellectual empire on that premise. Books that sold 10 million copies. A following of tens of millions across every digital platform on Earth. He looked at the broken young men of the Western world and said, with the precision of a psychologist and the urgency of a prophet, clean your room. Tell the truth. Stand up straight. Carry your cross. And they listened. Because he meant every word. Now, in the spring of 2026, Jordan Peterson is at home. Not giving lectures. Not appearing on podcasts. Not weighing in on the political crises his absence leaves strangely quieter. He is at home with his wife of 37 years, with companions who help him through the hours. His mornings, according to the woman who has spent her life beside him, are brutally painful and discouraging. Later in the day, much later, she was careful to say, there is sometimes relief. The man who taught the world to bear suffering is now learning something he could not have scripted. What it feels like when the suffering has no clear meaning yet. And here is the question worth sitting with before we go any further. What do you do when the philosophy you gave your entire life to defending is the very thing the world now expects you to prove with your own body? This is not a story about controversy. It is not a story about the culture wars that made Peterson one of the most polarizing and celebrated intellectuals of his generation. This is a story about one man, one woman, one marriage, one diagnosis, and what happens when a life built on confronting hard truths arrives at the hardest truth of all. His wife said it plainly. 4 words. He is not talking about going back to work yet. 37 years of marriage, 30 years of public life, and now silence. That silence, and what lives inside it, is what this story is about. Fairview, Alberta is not the kind of place that produces global icons. It sits in the northwestern corner of Canada's prairie provinces. Flat, cold, and far from everything. A small town where winters arrive early and stay long. Where the horizon is an unbroken line of sky and frozen earth. Jordan Burnt Peterson was born there on the 12th of June, 1962. He grew up in that cold, that flatness, and that distance. And he read. Obsessively. Relentlessly. The kind of reading that is less a hobby and more a survival strategy. What compels a boy from the Canadian prairies to spend his adolescence wrestling with the darkest questions in Western philosophy? What drives someone that young toward Jung and Dostoevsky and Nietzsche, toward thinkers who stared directly into the abyss and came back with maps? There are no simple answers. But this much is true. Jordan Peterson did not stumble into the study of suffering. He went looking for it deliberately. Because something in him sensed, very early, that the questions no one wanted to ask were the only questions that mattered. He studied political science before pivoting to psychology, a pivot that would define everything. He completed his doctorate at McGill. He taught at Harvard. Then in 1998 he returned to Canada and took a position at the University of Toronto, where he would spend 2 decades turning lecture halls into something closer to confessionals. Places where young people, mostly young men, came to hear someone finally say the things they had felt but could not articulate. His first book appeared in 1999. Dense, demanding, and deeply original. It was not a bestseller. It was something more durable, a foundation, a signal sent quietly into the intellectual atmosphere that a different kind of thinker had arrived. For the next 17 years, Peterson built his reputation the slow way.
Lecture by lecture.
Student by student. The lectures, eventually uploaded to YouTube, found audiences his classrooms could never have contained. Millions of views. Then tens of millions. Then came 2016. And everything changed overnight. The Canadian government introduced legislation that, in Peterson's interpretation, would compel the use of specific gender pronouns under threat of legal sanction. Peterson refused. He made videos explaining his refusal. He went on television. He debated. He stood in the wind of institutional pressure and did not move. The backlash was immediate and ferocious. The support was equally immediate and equally ferocious. Within weeks, Jordan Peterson had become the most talked about academic on earth. But here is where the story takes a turn nobody predicted, because the price of that rise had not yet been paid. 12 Rules for Life, published in January of 2018, detonated. 10 million copies. Translated into 50 languages. a book about personal responsibility, Jungian archetypes, and biblical narrative that outsold memoirs, thrillers, and celebrity cookbooks. He toured every major city in the Western world, sold out theaters, stood before thousands who had come not just to listen, but to tell him through their tears and their applause that what he was saying had changed something fundamental in how they understood their own lives. And at the height of all of it, the tours, the interviews, the global platform, Tammy got sick. 1989 was when Jordan Peterson married Tammy Roberts. They had known each other since they were 8 years old. By the time they married, she was not simply his wife. She was the architecture of his life. And in 2019, she was diagnosed with kidney cancer. What do you do when the foundation of everything you have built is suddenly under threat? When the one relationship that preceded the fame, the books, the lectures, the millions of followers, when that relationship is suddenly fighting for its life? You do what you can. You try to hold everything together. He took medication to manage the anxiety and sleeplessness. A benzodiazepine called clonazepam, prescribed to help him cope with the impossible weight of watching his wife face a diagnosis that carried no guarantees. It was, at first, just that, a tool. A medical intervention in a moment of acute crisis. What he could not know, what no one told him clearly enough, was that benzodiazepines carry a cost that arrives on the back end. Dependency forms quietly. Withdrawal, when it comes, does not arrive gently. And by the time Peterson understood the depth of the trap he was in, he was already inside it. He tried to stop. The withdrawal was catastrophic. In 2020, in an act of desperate medical search, he traveled to Russia for a procedure involving medically induced sedation, an attempt to sleep through the worst of the withdrawal in a controlled clinical environment. He spent a month in a Russian intensive care unit. He came back diminished. Not defeated. Never that. But diminished. In 2022, he sat across from Joe Rogan and said something that landed with the quiet force of a confession. I was in excruciating pain for 2 years. Pain on levels that I didn't know was possible. Think about that sentence for a moment. The man who wrote the book on suffering, sitting in a podcast studio, admitting that pain had found registers in him he had not known existed. Tammy survived. The cancer did not win. And Peterson slowly, painfully rebuilt. He released Beyond Order in 2021, written during the worst of it, while still recovering. A book about the necessity of meaning in the face of chaos, written by a man living inside the chaos he was describing. He returned to public life. He kept going. He always kept going. But the body was keeping a different kind of account. And in Zurich, during a hospitalization for pneumonia, the account came due. He checked in for pneumonia. Serious, yes, but manageable. The kind of medical episode that a man of 63, already battle-scarred from years of withdrawal and recovery, might reasonably expect to survive and move past. He had survived worse. He had survived a Russian intensive care unit. He had survived 2 years of pain at levels, in his own words, that he didn't know was possible. He survived the pneumonia too. But in that Swiss intensive care unit, something else entered his bloodstream. Sepsis. A systemic infection. The body's immune response spiraling beyond control. And what that sepsis did to a nervous system already carrying the accumulated damage of years of benzodiazepine withdrawal, it did not simply pass through. It landed. It took hold. What emerged from that hospitalization was a man with tardive akathisia. Say those words slowly, because they deserve precision. Tardive, meaning delayed, meaning the damage arrives not in the moment of exposure but later, sometimes much later, after the medication has long been discontinued. Akathisia, from the Greek, meaning inability to sit still. A neurological condition characterized by internal restlessness so severe, so unrelenting, so physically overwhelming that patients describe it not as discomfort but as torment. The body generating distress signals from the inside with no off switch and no clear exit. It is a condition known to occur as a consequence of discontinuing certain psychiatric medications, drugs that block dopamine receptors, that alter the brain's fundamental signaling architecture, that the central nervous system builds its entire functional equilibrium around. When those drugs are removed, the system that adapted to them is suddenly without its anchor. And in some patients, not all, but some, the result is a neurological injury that does not resolve. That persists. That can be permanent. Jordan Peterson spent 6 years trying to get free of one medication. And the process of getting free left him with a condition that may be with him for the rest of his life. Think about the architecture of that tragedy. Not a sudden accident, not a diagnosis that arrived from nowhere, but a slow-motion cascade. Each decision made in good faith. Each medical intervention pursued in crisis. Each step of the withdrawal undertaken in the sincere belief that the other side would eventually arrive. And the other side, for Jordan Peterson, has not yet fully arrived. By early 2026, something had changed visibly in his public presence. Events disappeared from his website. Quietly, without announcement, the calendar that had once been filled with speaking engagements and international appearances went blank. No statement.
No explanation.
Just absence. The kind of absence that speaks louder than any press release. Then in April of 2026, his daughter Michaela told the world what the blank calendar already suggested. Her father was taking time away from everything. The cause was a neurological injury induced by psychiatric medications. The world heard it and held its breath, because Jordan Peterson is not just a famous person who is ill. He is the person who built an entire intellectual architecture around the proposition that suffering can be made meaningful. That the human being, when faced with the worst the world can offer, has both the capacity and the obligation to find within that worst something worth carrying forward. He is the man who told millions of people in the middle of their own private collapses that the antidote to chaos is to accept the weight and walk forward anyway. And now the walk itself is the hard part. On the 4th of May 2026, Tammy Peterson gave an interview to the New York Post. It was not long. It was not dramatic. It was something rarer, and in its restraint, more devastating. A wife telling the truth about her husband without catastrophizing, without minimizing, and without pretending the situation is other than what it is. She said he is at home with family and helpful companions. She said his mornings are brutally painful and discouraging. Later in the day, much later, he sometimes feels some relief. And then she said the sentence that stopped everything. He feels as if he is in another realm of pain. Not a different degree of the same pain. Another realm entirely. A place the map does not cover. A territory without the landmarks that ordinarily allow a human being to orient themselves and say, I know where I am, and I know which direction leads out. What does it feel like to wake up in a body that is sending signals of distress before the day has even begun? And to know that the philosophy you built your life around is now the very lens through which the world is watching you live? Tammy did not stop there. She turned toward the system. She said the damage done from psychiatric medications takes patience, time, and loving attention. And then, with a precision that carried more weight than any lecture her husband ever gave, she said, benzodiazepines should only be used in life-saving cases. That is not bitterness. That is not accusation. That is testimony. The testimony of a woman who has watched from the closest possible distance what happens when the medical system prescribes a dependency-forming drug to a man in crisis without adequately communicating what the exit will cost. Jonathan Pageau, theologian, artist, one of Peterson's closest friends, described what the days actually look like from the outside. Good days look like struggle and pain, he said. But he is still capable of taking walks, working on projects, having good conversations, just with difficulty. And never for long. Bad days are constant pain and akathisia. He struggles to focus on anything. Lapses into discouragement and despair. Never for long.